I just do it so we don't have to interrupt the meeting
Okay.
with the phantom Zoom lady voice.
All right. And the attendance list after the
You
event.
sent me that and I started to look into it, and then I was like, I got to do this with Zoom open. So hold on, let me just open it back up. Make sure that I know what I'm doing here. We do have a whole bunch of people signed up, and I actually need to check the sign up and make sure there's no stragglers. We always get people who like don't realize they have to sign up, and then in the last like 30 seconds they're like, how do I get in?
I sent my students an email yesterday telling them, or the day before actually, telling them to look out for your email.
Great. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me just oh. All right, we got one student looking for the link, so let me just do that. Usually when we do this, we have like two of us behind the scenes. So like I'll like email the last minute people and Mahela will introduce, so we'll just see how we do basically.
I'm sure it'll be fine.
She is out on medical leave, and so we're just trying to do it again basically. So let me get
one other question when you have a second. I don't
know. Go ahead. I'm just copying and pasting the link into an email, so go ahead.
So how are we going to do the Q&A? Like, how long do you want to do that for? And are you going to ask me questions from the chat? Is that?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess, how long do you think your presentation is going to be roughly?
30 minutes or so.
Great. So I'm going to tell people to put questions into the chat. And I have some, kickoff questions.
Okay.
In case everyone's crickets. But sorry, I'm copying all these emails.
That's all right.
But we try to keep it to an hour.
Okay.
If we if people sort of peter out before then, that's okay, but usually we try to keep it to an hour. So
Okay.
I'll sort of jump in and say, we're getting close to 7 and I know y'all want to eat dinner or whatever. And
that's true.
So, all right, I just sent to the stragglers. Okay. So now we have 63 people signed up.
Oh wow. Okay.
I guess one of them might be you, so but
yeah.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, that is.
Okay. Hey, there you are. So yeah, I'll have people put stuff in the chat, and I can read them out to you, so you don't have to look at it.
That'd be great.
And so, like, if people are like, random thought, more of a comment than a question.
Oh God, those people.
Yes. So, I think I'm just looking at my notes about what I'm going to introduce you, but I think I basically just modified the blurb that we had from the site.
That's fine.
So, we got 15 people in the waiting room. We'll wait a couple more minutes and let them in.
It's amazing what people will do for extra credit.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, so you haven't talked about this in class with them?
In my environmental history class, yes, a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I know what I was going to ask you. I saw in your tweet that you put a discount code. Is that something you want me to mention?
It's on my last slide.
Okay. Oh, great. Okay.
I have that there.
So I will just say that you'll share some information about where you can get a copy and.
Yep. Directly from the publisher.
Great.
Yeah. I only need to sell 267 more books before I get paid. So, yeah. He sent me an email, told me.
So specific. Well, we did order 2 copies for our gift shop as testers to see, and we sold them already. So I have next time I put an order in to Ingram, we'll get more, probably another 5 to 10 copies. So
Okay, thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you for supporting a struggling author.
well, it's certainly a very interesting topic, and like one that is in the forefront of a lot of people's minds up here. So, you know, it's there's that tension is playing out, you know, in everyday life with so many people being employed as COs and stuff. So
Sure, yeah.
And you know, the park is always a source of tension, regardless of if we're
Right.
talking about prisons or not.
Exactly, yeah.
So okay, I'm just going to take my note about this. Okay. My husband is making dinner in the other room. I told him not to scream, so but I will probably mute myself while you're talking, and I'll unspotlight myself so that you know you don't have to watch me sitting here.
That's fine. I do that too.
But my cats may or may not make an appearance. So
okay, I like to see cats. Yeah.
I forget what I was in a housing group meeting, local housing group, and my cat came and stood, and no one said anything, and I was like, excuse me, my cat's here.
It's happened at a lot of meetings I've been in.
Yeah.
Cats walk across.
Yes. Yeah, or they like sit here and like look.
Right. They watch. Yeah.
All right. So are you ready? We can start letting people in?
Yeah, whenever you're ready.
All righty. Oh, Mahala's here. Cool.
Progress.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good evening. We're gonna just give a few more minutes as people are coming into the waiting room here. So if you just hang tight for a minute and we'll get started. Yeah, and if you want to introduce, I know there's a lot of folks on the call tonight that haven't attended any historic Saranac Lake events before. So if you want to say hi and tell us where you are, we would love to know a little bit more.
Hey, I'm Chris Olson, and I am tuning in from Madison, Wisconsin, but grew up just south of the Adirondacks.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, my name is Ron Van Cleef. I'm a colleague of Jeff's at Queensborough Community College. Just joining in to see the talk. Thanks.
Thanks, Ron. Just got a few more stragglers here. Okay. I think we can go ahead and get started. Looks like we've got most everybody in here. So I am Chessie Monks Kelly. It's nice to virtually meet you all. I'm the archivist and curator at Historic Saranac Lake and the Saranac Laboratory Museum. And I just want to make sure, I think I've muted everybody, but if you could just keep your microphones off. We are recording this talk, and we want to make sure that there's no background noise. So please keep your mics muted. Feel free to use the chat function. And if you want to have your video on, that's great, but you don't have to. Like I said, I think a lot of you are joining us for the first time at Historic Saranac Lake. So I just want to briefly tell you about the organization and what we do. So we are a nonprofit. We run the Saranac Laboratory Museum, and our primary focus, we talk about the history and the architecture of Saranac Lake, most of which focuses on the tuberculosis industry and the people who came from all over the world to cure from tuberculosis in Saranac Lake between the 1870s and the 1950s. We have a unique history in many ways and unique architecture that goes along with it. So we want to make sure that we preserve those things to build a better community and inform future generations. So we run the museum. We're in the middle of a major expansion project to expand into the former home and medical office of Dr. Edward Livingston Trudeau, who started the TB industry. And so if you come visit us in the next 3 or so years, things will look dramatically different from when they might a year ago. So you can stay tuned for updates on that project. We're really excited to expand, to be able to tell more stories about Saranac Lake history, from TB patients, of course, but to great camps and winter carnival and things like that. So we are also working on some major projects to get our collections cataloged and make those catalogs available online to the public. So we'll actually be announcing some stuff about that later on this month. So you can actually browse our collections, a portion of them from home soon enough. So that's exciting. So we do events like this all the time. We're entering a little bit of a slow season for us, but we are open year round at the museum if you want to come pay us a visit. But we do have a couple events scheduled. We do regular walking tours of Trudeau Sanatorium, and there's one next week, and then one the second week in December on the schedule so far. But you can find out about any events we have upcoming at the museum on our website, which is historicsaranac.org. That's just very brief about our organization, but if you want to find out more, there's always something going on. So you can always check out our website, as I said, or you can reach out to me or one of our staff members, and we'd love to talk to you more. Tonight, of course, we are here to discuss A Prison in the Woods by Clarence Jefferson Hall Jr., aka Jeff, and this is the book here. If you do not have a copy, I recommend it. So I know that there are a lot of students from Jeff's class here tonight, which is great, from Queensborough Community College. And I just want to say thanks for joining us. It's nice to connect with new audiences, and hopefully you learned something new tonight. If you're not familiar with Jeff's work, either as being a student, or if you haven't read the book yet, I'm going to introduce him briefly, and then I'll turn it over to you, Jeff, to present. If you have questions that come up during the talk, you can use the chat function to put them in, and we'll do a Q&A at the end. Anything that pops in your mind as we're going, please stick it in there and we'll check in. I also want to mention a resource that we have that might be of interest after the talk, which is our local history wiki. It's always free and it's available online, and it's more than 6,000 pages on Saranac Lake area history, including some of the TB sanatoria that became prisons that Jeff will be talking about this evening. So if you want to go down the rabbit hole on some of those, you can check that out, and that's on our website as well, or you can go to localwiki.org/HSL, and I can put that in the chat. for this evening's presentation, Jeff's going to use case studies drawn from the book to introduce listeners to the many ways in which the Adirondack environment proved a pivotal force in the planning, construction, and operations of prisons in Northern New York. Jeff will also focus on how the opening of prisons in the North Country and the incarceration of thousands of men of color in their cells both scrambled the region's racial politics and created an important, if largely invisible, environmental legacy. And Jeff grew up near Plattsburgh, which is not far from here, and currently works as an assistant professor, as many of you know, in the Department of History at Queensborough Community College in the City University of New York, and as a visiting instructor in sustainability studies at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. His research investigates intersectional histories of environment, race, and incarceration in the United States. And this is Jeff's first book, I'm sure not the last, but it was published in November 2020. And Jeff's going to share more about where you can purchase the book at the end of the talk. If so, stay tuned for that. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Jeff, and you can go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chessie, for the nice introduction and for all the information about your organization, which I'm familiar with, but I'm sure many of my students are not. So I hope they learned something new about Saranac Lake, a place that I've visited my whole life and always enjoy going to. I'm going to bring up my slides here. So let me see if I can.
On spotlight myself. There we go. All you.
Okay. All right. Thanks. So as Chessie said, I go by the shortened version of my middle name. My name is Jeff Hall. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And I'm speaking to you from Queens, New York. I was actually in the North Country for the past 19 months, riding out the pandemic, doing my job completely from home. But I'm back in Queens for the past 5 days or so, and that's where I'm working from tonight. Queens, this part of Queens where I'm living, is the unceded territory of the Munsee, Lenape, and Canarsie Algonquin nations. Lenape and Canarsie people have served and continue to serve as caretakers of New York City's lands and natural resources. I want to thank Chessie again, Mahala Nyberg, and their colleagues at Historic Saranac Lake for this invitation. For those of you who have not visited, I want to recommend the Saranac Laboratory Museum in Saranac Lake that Chessie mentioned before. I spent a really nice Saturday afternoon in the museum about a year ago in October 2020, shortly before it closed due to a resurgence of COVID-19. I was also happy to visit the Cure Porch on Wheels at the Ice Palace in Saranac Lake this past February. Chessie mentioned the architecture of Saranac Lake, much of which involves the treatment and care of people diagnosed with tuberculosis. And many of those folks would often sit out and lay out on porches and breathe in the fresh air of the Adirondacks as a way to cure themselves of this disease. And the Cure Porch on Wheels is sort of a traveling exhibit that brings that history to local populations. It's a really clever and intriguing part of Historic Saranac Lake's program. I will always treasure my Historic Saranac Lake Cure Porch on Wheels keychain, which I have here. I picked this up last year, and my lapel pin, which you can see right there. I'm happy to be able to speak to you this evening. It's unfortunate that we can't be together in person, but I do hope everyone finds the talk both interesting and informative, and I do look forward to answering your questions and listening to your comments at the end. For the past 16 years, I've been working on the environmental history of incarceration in the US, with a special focus on New York's North Country. During that time, I've had many opportunities to share my work and ideas with others. Upon hearing of my interest in this topic, the reactions of people unfamiliar with either me or my work have often contained a mixture of befuddlement, confusion, circumspection, and sometimes a furrowed brow. Nevertheless, for every person I've confused, there have been others, in many cases, total strangers, who seem to immediately understand and appreciate the value of my work. One encounter in particular has stuck in my memory. I was taking the Long Island Railroad to Penn Station one day in the early 2010s when an older woman took the seat next to me. We started talking, and in the course of the conversation, I shared with her the topic of my research. What followed was a richly rewarding chat where I felt that finally someone understood what I was doing. As we were leaving the train, this 80-something New Yorker turned, pointed her finger in a really accusatory way, and instructed me, "You must turn this into a book." Hardly ever one to disobey my elders, I did just that. I will talk about the book more in a moment. First, though, I want to revisit the folks I told you about earlier, the ones seemingly perplexed by the idea that prisons and the environment could be connected. I understand the confusion. After all, for how many people does the word environment conjure images of a prison? By the same token, prisons don't exactly match with the chirping birds, leafy trees, and babbling brooks that, for many, represent the environment. If the apparent intellectual chasm separating prisons and the environment were the only source of confusion, I could easily respond by saying, "You're wrong. Prisons and the environment are connected. Read my book and find out." But the roots of both the confusion and the chasm run deeper. With some exceptions, popular culture in the US has presented an image of prisons as isolated and self-contained environments that exist seemingly outside any fixed geographic boundaries. Think of all the episodes of Law and Order, if you've ever watched that program. You really can't miss it if you have cable, where the police and prosecutors visited Dannemora, the name of Clinton Correctional Facility prominently displayed on the screen. The studio standing in for Clinton could have easily represented any prison anywhere in the country. While but one example, it speaks to one of the central themes of my book. While many Americans may have been conditioned to believe that what goes on inside a prison has no impact on the world outside, and vice versa, the history of prisons in New York's North Country shows that that has never been the case. While the ties binding prisons and their environments may be unfamiliar to many people living today, they were crystal clear to the public officials who planned and built them in the Adirondacks. And this just shows you the Adirondack Park. Beginning in the 1840s and
Hey, Jeff, I accidentally muted you, sorry. Yeah, sorry about that.
That's okay. That's what makes variety as the spice of life. Beginning in the 1840s and continuing into the 1990s, the environment was a pivotal factor in the planning, construction, excuse me, and operation of prisons in northern New York State. We'll start in the Clinton County village of Dannemora, which you can see on our map here, which in the early 1840s was an unnamed, uninhabited spruce forest, home to exactly one human-built structure, a long abandoned ramshackle hunting cabin. So this town didn't exist at the time that we're talking about. At the time, the early 1840s, New York's two existing prisons, Auburn and Sing Sing, were dangerously overcrowded, prompting state officials to begin planning a third prison. But prisons cost a lot of money to build, operate, and maintain. State leaders thus decided their next prison had to be financially self-sufficient. The environment of central Clinton County, where Dannemora is located, proved attractive because of its extensive untapped supplies of iron ore, which, state officials surmised could be mined by imprisoned men and sold to private manufacturers and consumers. Profits earned from such sales, New York leaders hoped, would keep the prison solvent, thereby lessening the state's financial burden. The fortunes of Clinton State Prison, opened in 1845, were thus irrevocably linked to the natural world that lay both behind and beyond its walls. And this is a drawing of the prison in 1869, so about 25 years or so into its existence. However, the environmental transformations unleashed by Clinton's construction were not limited to the mining of iron ore. You can sort of see all that smoke and sort of industrial facilities there behind the wall. That's where some of the mining was actually going on. It was actually coming to an end by that point. The decision to build in the middle of a largely undeveloped wilderness meant that everything the prison needed in order to operate had to be built from scratch. So prisons are always expensive, but especially when you build one in the middle of nowhere. To overcome this significant challenge, lawmakers withdrew 20,000 acres of land surrounding the prison from sale, cordoning off local water, timber, and mineral resources for prison use only. Imprisoned men were enlisted to help build the prison itself, using locally cut stone and timber to erect a wall, which you can see there, which was almost always in danger of falling down, cell blocks, which you can see, and mining infrastructure. So imprisoned workers built all of this. To ensure the health and safety of people living and working in an often harsh and unpredictable climate, incarcerated workers installed amenities largely unfamiliar to most Americans at the time: indoor plumbing via a network of pipes connected to a nearby spring, and an unusually sophisticated indoor climate control system. So the facility was actually built in such a way that would allow people to be incarcerated there and to work there no matter what the season was, no matter what the weather was. Nevertheless, in a region as sparsely populated and remote as Clinton County, the new prison would never achieve self-sufficiency without modern infrastructure beyond its walls. Many incarcerated men thus found themselves outside the prison, cutting trees for fuel, construction materials, and perhaps most importantly, the building of roads connecting the prison to nearby communities and rail depots. As the population of both Clinton and the surrounding village of Dannemora grew in the 1850s and 1860s, the prison generated significant environmental ripple effects as local farmers and entrepreneurs cleared new planting fields, erected new homes and businesses, and entered into increasingly lucrative business deals with the prison. Unfortunately, revenues earned from the sale of prison-produced shoes, nails, farm produce, and other goods neither matched nor exceeded the enormous costs incurred from constructing the facility, excuse me, thus preventing Clinton from ever achieving financial independence. As I said, it cost in the mid-19th century hundreds of thousands of dollars every year to build and maintain this institution, and any profits that might have been earned from mining activity or other goods that the prison produced and sold would never match the huge costs that went into building this place. However, despite those financial difficulties, the experience of building and operating Clinton during its first 2 decades taught state officials an important lesson, namely that the value of prisons and poorly paid incarcerated workers extended far beyond their ability to incarcerate. So prisons could be used for other things, right? Correctional institutions, state leaders learned, could be used to jumpstart far-reaching environmental and economic transformations in their host regions. Armed with this knowledge, lawmakers would have little incentive to reduce the state's increasingly heavy reliance on imprisonment as a form of punishment. Fast forward to the early 1970s. New York was facing an economic death spiral. Industries across the state were shutting down. Rising joblessness exhausted state unemployment and public assistance funds. Those who could fled the state in search of jobs and economic stability in the South and West, the Sun Belt, taking their increasingly precious tax dollars with them. A diminished tax base meant smaller budgets for schools, parks, hospitals, transportation, and other public services and infrastructure, imperiling the quality of life, health, and safety of all New Yorkers. For those unable to move, the future appeared grim. Excuse me, as more and more New Yorkers struggled to meet the basic requirements of everyday survival. As was always the case, the burdens of economic collapse fell heaviest on New York's poor and people of color. Just to survive, many began turning to unlawful activities, and soon the state's urban centers, where most of New York's people of color lived, were gripped by increasing rates of violent and nonviolent crime. This is actually quite similar to what was going on in the early 19th century that drove New York to build its first prisons. Coming on the heels of the post-war civil rights movement, the economic crisis and societal breakdown of the early 1970s prompted a harsh backlash. Appealing to the same racial hysteria that characterized many white reactions to the achievements of the civil rights movement, in 1973, Republican Governor Nelson A. Rockefeller signed into law a package of amendments to New York's Narcotics Control Act of 1966. The Rockefeller drug laws, as these amendments came to be known, mandated long prison sentences for the possession and or sale of minuscule amounts of a variety of banned narcotics. The typical sentence would have been 15 years to life in prison for anybody 16 years of age and older. With many impoverished people of color active participants in New York's narcotics trade, and with all susceptible to police corruption, state lawmakers all but guaranteed the mass imprisonment of Black and brown New Yorkers. This was no accident. The only remaining question before state officials concerned where they would be imprisoned. This question acquired heightened urgency in 1975 as New York's 32 prisons approached full capacity. Efforts to locate new prisons in the New York City suburbs met stiff resistance from residents concerned about property values and public safety. So many of the same people who wanted prisons to be built just didn't want them built near where they lived, right? They were fully in favor of these narcotics laws. They just didn't want to have to deal with the side effects. Perhaps unsurprisingly, many of the affluent suburbanites who opposed the placement of prisons in their backyards were also fervent supporters, as I just mentioned, of the very drug laws that made new prisons a necessity in the first place. Increasingly desperate for new cell space, correctional planners looked northward, hoping the Adirondacks could once again help alleviate overcrowding in New York's prisons. However, the North Country of the 1970s in no way resembled the sparsely populated wilderness of the 1840s. A region that had long been remote and inaccessible now boasted dozens of communities populated by year-round residents and second homeowners that was also popular with seasonal tourists. So by the 1970s, the Adirondacks is a beehive of activity throughout the year. In addition, a panoply of environmental laws enacted beginning in the late 19th century meant the unrestricted and unregulated environmental transformations witnessed at Dannemora in the 1840s could not be repeated, or could they? Time and again, environmental laws and regulatory agencies, many assumed were guardians of public and environmental health, proved unable to stop potentially hazardous prison construction projects from reaching fruition. Consider the case of Raybrook, a small hamlet in Essex County, 6 miles west of Lake Placid, actually sort of in between Lake Placid and Saranac Lake on Route 86. To alleviate, Route 86, to alleviate overcrowding in the state's other prisons. In September 1976, let's go back here. Governor Hugh Carey unilaterally converted Raybrook's former state-run tuberculosis hospital, which you can see here, as a minimum security prison. So as Chessie mentioned at the beginning during the introduction, there were several tuberculosis sanitaria hospitals that were built in this part of the Adirondacks, beginning in the late 19th century and into the early part of the 20th century. This one, located in Raybrook, opened in 1904 and closed in 1971. It briefly reopened as a narcotics rehabilitation center for women before closing again and then being reopened as a state prison. There's the same building. I took this photo about 10 days ago from the window of my car. Just in case you don't know, people who run the prisons generally don't like people taking photos of them. So this one was a drive-by, but you can see the photo of the building there. The main building of the prison looks exactly like it did when it was a tuberculosis sanitarium. Governor Carey took this action, converting this facility into a state prison without waiting for a legally mandated environmental review of the project by the Adirondack Park Agency. The Adirondack Park Agency, the APA, was founded in 1971 and is empowered to regulate building projects in the interest of environmental and public health on public and privately owned lands inside the Adirondack Park. So the APA is sort of like a zoning board for the entire park. So any kind of construction projects, even signs like this one you see here in this photo, or even larger projects like vacation home developments or people enlarging the size of their driveways, generally do have to go through a permitting process with the APA before their projects can go through. Though its power to oversee projects on state-owned properties like Raybrook's former tuberculosis hospital were limited to non-binding advisory review, meaning the prison could open regardless of whatever the APA said. This episode, where the governor simply converted this former hospital into a prison, demonstrated a significant weakness built into one of the state's most important environmental laws, namely that the state government could sidestep environmental regulation when building on its own land. So the APA's powers to regulate building projects on state land is extremely weak. And I think the governor took advantage of the opportunity that that provision provided to him. While the state's conversion of the Raybrook complex to a prison ultimately posed little harm to the surrounding environment, the same could not be said for the federal prison that opened directly across the road. Governor Hugh Carey's conversion of Raybrook's former tuberculosis hospital was the culmination of a months-long struggle in the mid-1970s for control of the massive 540-acre residential institution. In addition to the State Department of Correctional Services, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, which operates the federal prisons all across the country, and the Lake Placid Olympic Organizing Committee had also expressed interest in the property. So the state, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and Lake Placid's Olympic organizers were all interested in this one complex. The facility's abrupt conversion as a state prison left unresolved the housing dilemmas facing the Bureau of Prisons, which was struggling to build new cells for an increasing population of men in federal custody, and Lake Placid's Olympic organizers, who needed a single location in which to house more than 1,000 athletes and coaches expected to participate in the 13th Olympic Winter Games in February of 1980. With help from local Republican Congressman Robert C. McEwen, the Bureau of Prisons and Lake Placid Olympic Organizing Committee hatched a plan to build a brand new facility on an undeveloped piece of land across the road from the state prison in Raybrook. So because they couldn't get the former hospital as either an Olympic village or a prison, they decided, well, we'll just move across the street and build something new there. This new complex that was being planned would solve both bureaucracies' problems. And you can see this photo here of former Kansas Senator Robert Dole and one of the Olympic officials pointing at a model of the future prison. This facility would first house Olympic athletes during the 1980 Winter Olympics. And once the Olympics were closed, or once the Olympics ended and the facility closed, it would be renovated and converted and turned into a federal medium security prison. So both of these agencies would get something. Unfortunately, no one seemed to know who owned the 155-acre property chosen for construction. Maps that were held by different state agencies told different stories. Some said it was privately owned, while others claimed it was state property. Nobody really knew. To clear up the confusion, the Adirondack Park Agency exercised another one of its powers and reclassified the tract as state land. This move, however, exposed the project to a potentially long, drawn-out, and legally binding environmental review by the State Department of Environmental Conservation, the DEC, something neither the Bureau of Prisons nor Lake Placid's Olympic organizers wanted. So you see sort of the overlapping environmental agencies and regulations at play here, and the different powers that some had and some did not have. Once again, the APA, which many people in the North Country still assume is sort of like an environmental organization in disguise, the APA intervened on behalf of the Bureau of Prisons and Lake Placid's Olympic organizers, arguing for the federal government to take over the property. It was going to become a federal prison after all. That would eliminate the possibility of any state environmental review now or in the future. So the APA, the organization that many opponents of environmental law see as sort of this radical environmental organization, is actually taking sides with a major and potentially damaging development. The property's May 1977 transfer from state to federal ownership for $1, right? The federal government bought this property from the state for $1, all but sealed its environmental fate. Given a free hand to do as they pleased, federal contractors began tearing down 75 acres of Raybrook's forest in June of 1977. And I dare say that this scene, something like this scene, had happened in the mid-1840s in Dannemora, right? We have no photos of Dannemora under construction, but something very similar very likely went on there in order to make way for the prison that was subsequently built. So you might think that, you know, the 1970s is the environmental era. It's, you know, we've learned not to do these things, but here we see that we really haven't. After feeding the cut timber into wood chippers, they proceeded to flatten the deforested terrain through widespread excavation. So once the trees were removed, the ground was flattened. Heavy rains in August and September of 1977 washed hundreds of tons of unsecured wood chips and mud into nearby bodies of water, harming wildlife populations, damaging critical habitat, and befouling local fresh water supplies. Nearby residents vociferously objected to the seemingly unrestricted environmental destruction occurring in their community. But with the property under federal control, there was nobody to turn to. Even the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, claimed it had no jurisdiction over a project being built on federal land, arguing that as the future facility's first users, Lake Placid's Olympic organizers were responsible, right? Nobody wanted to be responsible for cleaning up the environmental damage caused by this project. The damage was only remediated when the federal government threatened to withhold workers' pay and funding necessary to complete the project in time for the Winter Olympics. So the very real threat that the project would not be finished in time for the Olympics is what ultimately forced the contractors to clean up the mess that was created through their sort of irresponsible behavior. But remember, their irresponsible behavior had been abetted by the Adirondack Park Agency, who had sort of held their hand all the way through this process. Oops, I went a little too fast. You just see some photos here of the construction of the facility, especially the photos on top and the one on the bottom left-hand side. You see the buildings being constructed there. This was one photo that I found during my research. This is actually not, this photo in the bottom right-hand corner is not from the federal prison site, but was for some reason included in this montage. This is what the facility looked like when it was completed, October of 1979, shortly before the first athletes arrived for the Winter Olympics. I've got to go back. Oh, and just an interesting side note, and I write about this in my book a little bit. One interesting feature of local prison history is that really anytime a new prison opened, the public was invited in to come and take a look and walk around and check out the grounds and check out the buildings. And sometimes even these events happened, these open house events happened after the prisons opened. And sometimes even imprisoned men were enlisted to serve as tour guides. So I include this photo here just to show you an early example of this, a tour of the future federal prison in Raybrook after it was finished in the fall of 1979. The opening of two prisons in Raybrook within 4 years of each other, outside established environmental legal frameworks, underscored the degree to which prisons posed risks to the North Country environment as great as those unleashed at Dannemora in the 1840s, when the very idea of environmental law was but a fantasy. The experience of Raybrook also taught state leaders a very important lesson, namely that environmental regulations were no barrier to opening prisons inside the Adirondack Park. This was a particularly valuable lesson, as the need for new prisons did not abate with Raybrook, as the ever-increasing state prison population only deepened Albany's interest in building prisons in the North Country throughout the 1980s and 1990s. However, the experience of Raybrook also taught residents and homeowners an important lesson, namely that preventing potentially grave prison-induced harm to environmental and public health would require grassroots resistance. Unfortunately, arguments against building prisons, especially those put forward by tourists and second homeowners, often reflected opponents' class and racial biases. This proved especially true in the Franklin County hamlet of Gabriels, after the state proposed converting another old tuberculosis hospital as a minimum security prison in 1981. So this, Chessie mentioned earlier about the tuberculosis sanitaria that became prisons. This is another one. This was a facility that opened in 1894 and closed in the early 1960s, and then was taken over by a local college and then subsequently became a prison. And the name of this community is Gabriels. Homeowners in the Gabriels area, most of them seasonal residents, quickly organized a group known as Citizens Against More Prisons in the Adirondacks. And this group was formed to oppose the conversion of this former hospital as a prison. At the time, the former hospital was owned by Paul Smith's College, which is very close to the hamlet of Gabriels. And Paul Smith's college was planning to sell the property to the state for conversion as a prison. So you can see that's why this protest was held outside of Paul Smith's college on the weekend that students arrived for the fall semester in 1981. In letters sent to the Adirondack Park Agency, op-ed pieces published in local newspapers, and testimony delivered at park agency hearings, many argued that prisons were incompatible with the Adirondacks' historical promotion of leisure and outdoor recreation. However, much of this correspondence was also laced with not always thinly veiled racist vitriol directed at imprisoned men whose poverty and Blackness opponents contended disqualified them from inclusion in their mainly white and wealthy wilderness enclave. And I'll show you an example of one of these letters. And you can see the large paragraph there in the middle, sort of the argument this person's putting forward, that his family's been in Paul Smith's for 5 generations, so for probably over 100 years. They've seen many changes forced on the area, doesn't mention what those were. And then these statements: to put the dregs of New York in Gabriel's is unconscionable and shows an utter disregard for those of us who pay taxes there. So again, this argument that the community belongs to certain people and that other people should not even be allowed to stay there inside a prison, right? And that the reason for that has to do with race, right? The Adirondack Park, and specifically our area is no place for the scum that other counties and communities can't handle. So racially coded language there, the dregs of New York and scum. This person knew who he was referring to, and I'm sure the person who received and read this letter also knew. Unfortunately, arguments, excuse me, Spectrum is calling me right now, the internet company. They probably don't like my talk. Even the state's promise to increase the hamlet's recreational space by adding most of the Gabriel's property to the state forest preserve proved unimpressive to members of campus. So the state responded to these opponents by saying, hey, we won't use the entire property for the prison. We'll only use the part we need. The rest we'll add to the forest preserve. You can go hiking, you can go for a walk, you can take your dogs out, enjoy yourself. We'll only use the land that we need. And the opponents said, nope, we're not interested in that. That's not good enough for us. We don't want any prison at all. For prison opponents like C. Minot Dole Jr. here, protecting the area's woods and wildlife seemed less important than preserving its historically white and well-to-do demographic profile. Echoes of Campa's ultimately unsuccessful campaign to stop the prison in Gabriel's, that prison did open in 1982, could also be heard in the Franklin County village of Tupper Lake, where for nearly 2 decades, town officials determined to bring a prison to the community squared off against nearby residents, mainly seasonal homeowners again, who were equally determined to prevent such an outcome. In the 1980s and 1990s, members of Tupper Lake Concerned Citizens, the group formed to oppose building a prison in Tupper Lake, deployed racially coded messages designed to stir fear in the local population. So the people in Tupper Lake sort of took a page from the Gabriel's playbook in forming their opposition to a prison in their community. In letters sent to the park agency, op-ed pieces published in local newspapers, even these full-page advertisements like the one you see here, and testimony given at public hearings held in the 1980s and early 1990s, opponents amplified a commonly held view that most, if not all, imprisoned men of color were carriers of HIV/AIDS. And this was a common refrain throughout this long debate over a prison in Tupper Lake. They warned that a penitentiary in Tupper Lake could spark a public health crisis far beyond the prison walls. Members of TLCC also predicted that the families of men imprisoned in Tupper Lake might move to the community and disrupt the area's racial and class equilibrium. However, a more diverse local population was not their only concern. Giving voice to another racist stereotype, namely that all urban people of color were unworthy recipients of government-funded public assistance, opponents warned that a larger population of impoverished residents would inevitably lead to higher taxes for the area's white and well-to-do homeowners. While TLCC's, Tupper Lake Concerned Citizens, environmental arguments against the prison, much like those put forth by the folks in Gabriel's, were couched in racial and class bias, it was ultimately a previously undisclosed threat to local fresh water supplies that scuttled plans to build a prison in Tupper Lake in 1997. So the state actually came very close to building this prison in Tupper Lake. It had been approved by the state legislature. Construction had actually already started, but the opposition had really gained steam. And then again, maps came into play, and there was actually a debate over the maps in Tupper Lake. One map showed a very large aquifer right at the site where the prison was planned. Some other maps said there was no aquifer there, but ultimately the state said, you know what, we're not going to take a risk, and they didn't build the prison in Tupper Lake. I'm going to end by talking about the racial dynamics that structured the conflicts over building prisons and their place in the North Country environment. From the 1970s through the 1990s, both opponents and supporters of the prisons deployed racially inflected environmental arguments to defend their respective positions, and I've sort of gone over some of those with you. While many who resisted the opening of prisons claimed the Adirondack Park could only be used for leisure and outdoor recreation by white and well-to-do people like themselves, those who favored bringing prisons into the park often asserted that the Adirondacks was the best possible place to incarcerate men led astray by the chaotic forces of city life. And you actually see this argument way back to the mid-19th century of people saying, oh, the Adirondacks is the best place to incarcerate people. The air is clean here. There aren't a lot of people here. There are no bad influences. They're out in nature. They'll be reformed and go back to their homes and live productive lives. However, in many cases, local prison opponents did not bother to couch their racism in environmental terms. While prison critics generally confined their racist sentiments to private correspondence mailed to government officials, that letter I showed you before is actually an archival document, not something that was printed in a newspaper. Prison supporters and their allies have usually taken fewer pains to conceal their true feelings. Anyone who has spent time in the North Country knows this. While the Confederate battle flag and other white supremacist imagery have become ubiquitous across northern New York since 2016, this is nothing new. I'll relate some personal experiences to illustrate. I grew up in the North Country, as Chessie mentioned, in the 1980s and 1990s. My father, who's in this photo, if you look at the top right-hand corner, he's the second one down on the right-hand side, Clarence Hall. My father worked as an officer for the Department of Correctional Services and retired from Clinton Correctional Facility in 1998. So his career overlapped the period of what we call mass incarceration. And when he retired, the state very kindly put his name on a bulletin board outside the prison. The local prison industry was a big part of my family's life. I remember hearing prison employees, including my late father, casually use racial slurs to describe incarcerated people. It was just part of the oxygen there. I recall hearing folks refer to the buses used to transport incarcerated people to and from local prisons as the quote unquote African Queen. While working at a local steward shop when I was 17 years old, a regular customer who came in for coffee every morning would, as he was stepping out the door, always tell me that he had to go and, quote, pick up his load of coal, unquote. Only after asking my manager did I discover that this man ran a taxi business and that he ferried the family members of incarcerated people from the Plattsburgh bus terminal to the prison in Dannemora. Finally, not far from where I attended high school in Saranac, New York, there is a cemetery containing the remains of local men who died fighting in the Civil War. When I was in high school in the mid-1990s, Confederate battle flags began appearing on the dead soldiers' headstones. And this was actually a matter of controversy during that time, the mid to late 90s. Though just a few examples, they illustrate an important element of the North Country environment, white racism, that is as powerful a force as any storm that moves through the area. While it is correct that not every correctional employee or person connected to the prison system subscribes to racist ideologies, it is equally true that a good many do hold such views. In a correctional system where most of the employees are white and people of color make up most of the imprisoned population, it is difficult to imagine white racism not conditioning daily operations in North Country prisons. However, as I said before, this is not a new problem. In the book, I relate an episode from Clinton State Prison in 1856, that was 165 years ago, where white officers had effectively enslaved the facility's only African-American and imprisoned men as unpaid personal servants outside the prison. While such barbarism may be unimaginable today, the racist attitudes of 1856 are alive and well. And just to illustrate my point, this is a picture I took right before I came back down here to Queens last week of a truck that I saw just parked in the parking lot. And I'm sure many folks who've spent time in the North Country have seen a version of this, this window decal on cars and trucks, and also even seen the same flag, which is incongruous and makes no sense and is offensive. But again, just to show an example of what I'm talking about, a current present day example. Without the presence and labor of incarcerated people of color, the North Country, a place seemingly steeped in white racism, could not function. For decades, many men incarcerated in local prisons have been active participants in an outdoor work program run jointly by the Department of Environmental Conservation and the Department of Correctional Services. In towns and villages across the North Country, incarcerated men have completed a variety of vital public works and conservation projects. They have assisted with flood control, soil conservation, firefighting, and storm cleanup. They've built hiking trails, ski trails, parks, and campsites. They've refurbished scout camps, government offices, schools, churches, and libraries, among other activities. I'm just scratching the surface. And they've done this work for sometimes as little as $1 per day, right? Just to show you some examples here. This is from 1980. Again, sorry for the poor quality of this image from the Adirondack Daily Enterprise. I had a lot of difficulty getting access to the negatives, many of which don't exist anymore, of these photos. But this again shows you incarcerated men preparing to build the Ice Palace at the Saranac Lake Winter Carnival in 1980. A more recent picture of the same activity from 2013. Again, incarcerated people building this showpiece for this annual event that's been held in Saranac Lake since I think 1897. And then just 3 years ago, incarcerated men were used to fight a forest fire at the Altona Flat Rock, which is a state forest in Clinton County. It is next to impossible to live in or visit the North Country without touching the handiwork of imprisoned men. But for most visitors, seasonal homeowners, and permanent residents, their labor is invisible. Some may catch a fleeting glimpse of incarcerated men working outdoors from their car window, while others might read about quote unquote inmates fighting a forest fire in a local newspaper without any explanation of how or why they're engaged in such work. And I'm going to show you an example of this. This is from 2017. This is the Adirondack Daily Enterprise, the newspaper that's headquartered in Saranac Lake, a great newspaper, great local paper. And And you can see this is a description of the construction of the Ice Palace in Saranac Lake in 2017. And you can see just this casual reference in the last paragraph, crews of volunteers and state prison inmates, right? You know, to many people, I think outside of the North Country that might see state prison inmates and like their eyes would probably open and say, well, where are they from? Why are they there? What are they doing? How are they being paid? What are they being paid? But it became such a part, prison labor became such a part of life in the North Country over the past 176 years that it barely warrants a reference, right? State prison inmates, and just keep moving on. In either case, the opportunity for critical inquiry passes as quickly as the car speeds by or the page of the newspaper turns. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the creation of the Adirondack Park Agency, surely an important moment in local history that is receiving the attention it deserves. There's actually a new short film about this that you can actually find on YouTube if you want. But this anniversary, like others before it, reinforces a narrative that is exclusionary at best and at worst historically inaccurate. While the efforts of conservationists and preservationists, predominantly white and well-to-do men, to protect the Adirondacks are worthy of recognition, much of the work of building, maintaining, and preserving the North Country environment was left to imprisoned men of color. Knowing that many of these men were incarcerated for nonviolent economic offenses, their poorly paid work in the Adirondacks, even if voluntary, looks and feels like exploitation. So while the creation of the Adirondack Park Agency marked a critical shift in land use planning in the Adirondack Park, incarceration has played a far more pervasive role in shaping and reshaping the Adirondack landscape, and for far longer. It's important to remember prison labor outside of local prisons has been going on since Clinton opened in 1845. The Adirondack Park Agency, by comparison, is only 50 years old. In addition to being the much touted birthplace of American conservation, the Adirondacks is also a heretofore unacknowledged Black and brown landscape. The commemorative landscape of the North Country is chock full of memorials to conservationists. Some of you may know this set of tablets. This is along Route 86 near Whiteface Mountain near Monument Falls. The one on the left marking the on the right, I should say, marking the 50th anniversary of the creation of the State Forest Preserve in 1885. And then the one on the left, you can see marking that same event's 100th anniversary in 1985. So there are plenty of memorials to conservation and preservation efforts, tons of military themed monuments across the region, marking the area's involvement in the American Revolution and the War of 1812, and even monuments and plaques marking historical events and figures that may or may not exist, right? And here is one that sort of tells us the current residents of Champy, otherwise known as Champ, lake monster that apparently lives in Lake Champlain, and many people have claimed to have seen going back over 400 years, has its own marker. But where are the monuments to the young, impoverished Black and brown men caught up in a wave of racial hysteria that dropped them in the mountains and forests of northern New York? Why is this part of local history seemingly not worthy of recognition? Why is it so difficult for so many people to talk about? I hope that in time, the environment that incarcerated people made and continue to make in the Adirondacks will be as recognizable to residents and visitors as the region's many lakes, rivers, mountains, and prisons. And as Chessie mentioned, if you would like to order my book, and I'd greatly appreciate your support, if you order directly from the publisher, you can get a 30% discount. The discount code is on the screen, and you can easily find my book. If you can't remember that URL, you can just type the title of my book into Google, University of Massachusetts Press, and the discount code is there for you to get big savings, especially in time for Black Friday shopping. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm gonna, let's see, if we have any questions, we'll probably take about 10 or 15 minutes to answer some. Does that sound good? And if you have one, you can go ahead and put it in the chat. I just, to get us started, I wondered, well, first, you made me think of something. I have a children's book that we purchased for the collection at the museum that is about the building of the Ice Palace, I believe from the 80s, and they casually mention in the children's book that prison inmates help with the construction of the Ice Palace. So, you know, again, to sort of underscore the nonchalance about that, I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, it's just become natural.
Right.
I think it just became part of everyday life. People didn't give it a second thought. Yeah.
So I have a question for you to get us started. I wonder about the process for writing this book. You know, how did you, I know you mentioned the woman on the subway and you were working on your research at that point, but you know, how did you research and how did the publication come about?
Thank you. So at first, I really didn't know, when I came up with the idea, I didn't really know where to start. The prison part of this was actually going to be part of a bigger project. It was only going to be one chapter. And I got some good advice from my advisors, and they thought the prison piece by itself would be a good standalone project. So I said, okay, I'm going to do that. I didn't know a lot about the local prisons growing up. I mean, I knew the prisons were there, but to say I knew why they were there, who built them, who was involved, I had no knowledge. So I had to find all of that knowledge and all that information basically from scratch. And because there was nothing else written on the topic, I was sort of the first one to take this on. So I relied heavily on the local newspapers just to get started, just to sort of establish dates and names and build a timeline. And then I did the sort of usual traditional historical archival research that historians do when they're writing a history text. So I visited archives across the state. I visited small libraries. I talked with people who were involved, both people who were involved in opposition groups. I talked with people who were in favor of the prisons. I talked with people who had been incarcerated. I talked with family members of people who had been incarcerated. I talked with really people from a variety of different perspectives who had something to say about this topic. And then I had to distill all of that down to, you know, a 200 and something odd book, right? So I'm going to say, I like to tell students this sometimes. They ask me about doing historical research. This book, I probably had 500,000 pages of documents to go through, hundreds of books and articles to read to provide context. And then how much of that actually made its way into the book? Maybe 10%, I would say. I mean, if that. And so it was an unusual research process because I was looking at this from the environmental angle. And it's actually a good thing that I did that. I'll just tell, I think it's an interesting story about the research process. I approached someone at the state archives about their holdings, about what they might have about the local prisons, what documents they had in their collections that I could use. And I didn't hear anything for a while. And then I went to the conference on New York State history one year, and the archives had a table there. So I went over, and the person there just very casually told me, oh, we destroyed all of those documents years ago. So they actually didn't have any of what I was looking for. So my heart sort of sank, and I sort of like, oh, well, what am I going to do? So I actually put in a Freedom of Information Act request to the Adirondack Park Agency. And I just said, I wasn't professional at all, I'll be honest. Like, I've never filled one of these things out before. So it was a one-page form. I just said, just send me everything you have on these prisons. And I just took a chance. I dropped the thing in the mail, and I got back just one night. I got home, and there was a little envelope with, I could feel there was something hard inside. There were, I think, 3 CDs in the first delivery they sent me. And somebody there must have been really bored, had nothing to do, because they had scanned in one sitting, I guess, onto these CDs, about 100,000 pages of documents. And everything that the state archive said they didn't have was in the APA's holdings. So corrections department records that had been destroyed, and I confirmed that they had been destroyed because they weren't considered historically important, were in the APA records. So I had to sort of get access to those documents sort of indirectly, but I did end up getting them. And I actually ended up with way more than I needed. In fact, there's stuff that I'm planning to use for a new project that I never even used for the book. So anybody out there who's interested in doing historical research, patience is very, very important. You're not always going to get what you want the first time.
That is absolutely true. As the person who helps on the other end of the research, I can tell you that getting creative and being patient is it helps tremendously. We had a question come in the chat. Let me just scroll back up. What made you want to get this information out there, and what was your ambition for the project?
I think that, I mean, there's a couple different things. So I think the project is important for a couple reasons. One, I think many people think of the Adirondacks as a place that's a site of tourism, a place where people go to relax and enjoy themselves. And it is all those things. But I think many people who, even people who live there, don't understand just how pervasive the prison industry has been in the region. That the prisons are not these self-contained, isolated institutions that exist separate from the communities and the region in which they're located. That they exert enormous influence far beyond the walls and razor wire. But the problem is that you travel around the Adirondacks, you drive around, you walk around, you hike. There's no way of really knowing, in many cases, that you're passing over a place that was touched by incarcerated labor, right? Where I learned how to ski at White-Faced Mountain, I didn't know until I did the research for this project that incarcerated workers had been enlisted by the Lake Placid Olympic Organizing Committee to help cut the ski trails, to widen the trails for the Winter Olympics in 1980. So I wanted people to understand that what happens in prisons, at least in the North Country, and I think in general, affects everyone, right? Nobody is sort of immune from the influences of prisons, whether they know they're being influenced by incarceration or not. And I also want people to think about the Adirondacks differently. I want people to understand it's not just this playground for the rich, but that it's a place where residents have benefited from exploitation. I mean, my father was a corrections officer, not a job he ever wanted, a job he hated. I have a brother-in-law who's a corrections officer, not a job he wanted, and a job he hates. This is a system that hurts people on all sides. And that I think that we sort of have to recognize that this is the state, you know, when the state was building the prisons, they were always saying, oh, we're going to bring all these jobs. You're never going to lose your jobs because prisons are recession proof and they'll be here forever. They'll never close. And of course, that's turned out not to be true. But I think also that sort of obscures the reality of the prisons, right? The difficulties and the stresses and the challenges that incarcerated people face, but also the difficulties and the challenges and the stresses that the workers and their families face, right? Growing up in my house was no picnic. And I know that from friends of mine whose family members worked in prisons, faced something similar. So I think that there's sort of an environmental part of this that I want folks to know about, but also there's sort of a correctional part of this that I think I want folks to know about and appreciate more and understand the price that's been paid by people here in New York City, people in the North Country, because of mass incarceration.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. We got a question from Chris, who says, I realize you're interested in the prisons of the Adirondacks, but can you comment on the degree to which many of the same themes occur for prisons in rural areas elsewhere in the United States?
Well, it's a very good question. There are not many states in the US that built as many prisons as New York did. Texas is one, a lot of prisons in Texas, a lot of prisons in California. And there's a great book by Ruth Wilson Gilmore called Golden Gulag. Not really an environmental history like mine, but she looks into some of the same issues and questions that I look at in my book, but in California, which built a lot of prisons during the same period in the 70s and 80s and 90s, especially under the Republican governor of California, George Duke Majan. And of course, Texas is notorious for its use of both state and private prisons. And one of my former dissertation advisors just wrote a really excellent book on the Texas prison system. So those two states definitely, I think you can make some solid comparisons to New York State in terms of the number of prisons built and the ways in which they functioned as drivers of local economies and agents of environmental change.
Great. Let's see, we've got another question from Emily. How long did it take you to gather all the information you needed? Was it months or years?
Felt like half my life. It was, I would say, the gathering of the information. I mean, I'm still gathering information. I mean, that's the interesting thing. Like, I think anybody who writes a book, like, I still find myself sometimes I'll just be awake. You know, I'm an insomniac, so I'm like, you know, awake at 4 a.m. I can't really focus on anything too serious at that time, but I can chug coffee and I'll be like, oh, I wonder if there's anything out there on this topic. And I'm always finding new stuff. But for the actual book, I would say the research part of that, I'd say off and on, not every single day of the week for this number of years, but 8 years or so, you know, visiting archives, interviewing people, going to libraries, asking for stuff to be delivered to me. Yeah, that's a nice kitty.
I was going to say, sorry, a cat has been watching most of this presentation, so
Well,
you have
I hope he
a
doesn't
new
vomit.
fan. So what's next for you? Someone actually asked the same question just as I said that. Are you planning on writing another book? What are your plans?
If I live long enough. My next project that I want to work on, and this is actually something that I'd like students to be involved in. I'm actually applying for a grant for this right now. So Chessie, you may actually be interested in this too. I want to build a digital map that documents all the sites of incarcerated labor in the North Country, going back to the mid-19th century to the present. And that will involve a fair amount of archival research, and also somebody with digital skills that I don't have. But I'll hopefully get this grant, and that's my next project, is a digital humanities project. I do have another book project in mind that will sort of be a companion to the map. But the map is going to be the next major project I work on, because again, not everybody, and let's face it, not everybody who comes to these talks buys my book. I know that. Not everybody has the time to sit down and read a book. And I get that too. But I think more people will have the time and will have the interest if something is available online And they can go and see, okay, if you remember that map I showed you of the Adirondack Park, traditional map of the Adirondack Park, counties, bodies of water, mountains, towns. What it doesn't show you are all the places where incarcerated people worked. And that will be a new map, I think, that will be valuable for people visiting the region and also valuable for people living there, to understand the level of investment that folks made in this system.
That sounds great. Yeah, we would be happy to, keep us posted and see how we can help. And, it sounds like it could be a model for other projects as well. So that's always, of course, with a grant funded project, they're looking for that kind of thing anyway. But that's great.
Thank you.
I'm going to do a couple more questions, and then
Okay.
I think everybody probably wants to go eat dinner. So any tips on writer's block?
I'm going to be very honest. If you have writer's block, walk away. That's what I do. Walk away, clear your head, and go back the next day. Recognize that if you're not in the right headspace, if it's just not coming out, just know when to walk away, clear your head, and go back. Something I do too, I mean, if any of my students out there are struggling with writing or need advice, I write everything longhand. So I still am a notebook and pen person. And I will do notebook and pen, transfer to a Word file, save that. Just to tell you how I wrote my book, I go home, print out whatever I had written that day. The next day, take that with me, go back to my office or to the library or wherever I was working, and go through that with a pen. And until I was happy, I would keep doing that. And sometimes I could point out in my book pages where I could show you this paragraph probably I wrote 20 times or 30 times before I was happy with it. So if you're going to do any kind of serious writing for a living, I think you have to get used to that you may think that what you've written the first time is wonderful. Sometimes it is. But if you let someone else read it, especially a professional editor or copy editor, you'll find out most of the time that it's not. And you got to just keep going. And one other thing I'll say, always read your work out loud. Read it out loud to yourself, because your eyes will not catch everything. Your ears will, though. If something sounds bad or sounds awkward, it's probably bad or awkward and probably needs to be rewritten. So yeah, those are my writing tips for all you future writers out there.
That's great. You got a few, people in agreement thanking you for the advice. So let's do one more question, and then we'll wrap up. Chris says, I remember when the Olympic Village was built for the 1980 games / the prison. I'm curious to what degree prison labor contributed to the 1932 Olympics. That's
a great question. None that I know of. Though that's actually a project. It's interesting that someone would mention this. That's actually a project that I have on my list. When Franklin Roosevelt was governor of New York, the state underwent a period of prison expansion, and several new state prisons were built during his tenure. And that is a project that I've just been interested in, just because we often don't associate Franklin Roosevelt with incarceration, but several state prisons were opened in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And but to the best of my knowledge, no, there was no prison labor used to build any of the facilities for the 1932 Winter Olympics in Lake Placid. Great, thanks, Jeff. So I put a couple links in the chat. My coworker Mahela earlier dropped the link to the book at UMass Press with the discount code, so you can scroll up and find that. I've put in the link to our local history wiki again, if you want to, check out any of the history on Raybrook or Gabriel's, or why are we even talking about tuberculosis in the Adirondacks
to begin with. And then our website as well. So if you want to come visit the museum or find out more about what we do, any events and things like that. Anything you want to, final thoughts, Jeff, or before we call it an
No,
evening?
I just thank you everybody for coming, and my students, I'll just tell them, since I don't know, Chessie, I guess I didn't mention all my classes are still online. So I actually haven't met my students in person. So I will be going to the campus, and if you want to meet me in person, if you want to have a cup of coffee, I'll pay, and we can chat. Thanks for coming.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We had a great turnout, and we're glad to see some familiar names and some new names join us. As I mentioned at the top, we have recorded this, and so we will get it up on our YouTube channel, and I will share an email to everyone who's registered once it's up. And I'll also include the link to the book and things, so you don't have to scramble to write that down. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope you have a great evening.
Thank you.